Madame Duke proposed beneath the ash tree, smiled and said, "Now it's mine." A true story. Eleanor Duke was not born rich. She was born stubborn, which turned out to be more useful. She grew up in a small house on the edge of a valley town called Grover's Mill. Not a famous town, not a pretty one, just the kind of place that exists because someone had to stop somewhere, and that particular patch of ground was flat enough, wet enough, and close enough to other places that stopping there made sense. The town had one main road, one grain elevator, two churches, and a diner that had been run by the same family for 40 years, and served the same 4 breakfast items every morning without any sense that variety had ever been requested. People in Grover's Mill still knew whose grandfather had built which fence and whose grandmother had fought over which creek. That kind of memory is not nostalgia. It is a form of record-keeping. Land in that valley was not just property. It was proof that your family had existed, that they had mattered, that the ground had known their boots and let them pass without swallowing them whole. Owning land there meant something that went past the legal document. It meant your people had stayed. They had dug in. They had not left when things got hard, which things did routinely, because farming is hard everywhere and small-town farming is hard in ways that are particular and relentless, and not always visible from the outside. Eleanor grew up watching her father tend 60 acres like it was his religion. He checked the fences the way other men checked their watches, without thinking, without having to. The way you do when something has become so deeply practiced that it lives in the body instead of the mind. He knew every post, every corner, every low spot where the water pooled in March and stayed 3 weeks longer than you wanted it to. He could walk the perimeter of his land in the dark and tell you which fence post needed attention by the way the wire sounded in the wind. He talked to the land the way farmers do. Not in words, but in early mornings and tired evenings and sore hands that still worked through the cold months when the cold had no consideration for what still needed doing. She learned by watching him. She learned to read weather by the color of the sky at 4 in the morning. She learned which neighbors were worth trusting and which ones were worth watching. She learned that the land did not care how you felt about it. It only cared what you did to it. Her mother had been a practical, warm woman who died of a stroke the summer Eleanor turned 26, and who left behind a kitchen garden, a good wool coat, and a habit of plain speaking that Eleanor had absorbed without noticing it until she was older and could hear her mother's voice coming out of her own mouth in conversations with difficult people. Her father died 5 years after her mother, when Eleanor was 31. He left her the 60 acres, a tractor that coughed like a sick old dog every cold morning, and required a particular sequence of priming that he had explained to her twice, and she had written down in a notebook she kept in the barn, and a debt to the county land bank that was not enormous but was not small either, and that had to be dealt with before anything else could happen. Eleanor paid it off over 4 years by selling timber from the eastern slope one careful section at a time. She did not clear the slope. She thinned it, strategically, the way her father had taught her, taking what the forest had grown past needing and leaving the structure intact. She never cut so much that the hillside bled. When the debt was gone, she took a single evening to sit on the porch and acknowledge that she had done what needed doing, and then the next morning she was up before light and at work. After the debt she started buying. Slowly, wisely, the way her father had taught her to do everything. A neighboring farm came available in her late 30s when the family who owned it had 3 sons and none of them wanted to farm, and the old man finally accepted that. 40 acres. Eleanor bought it at a fair price, not a low one. She had always believed that paying fair prices made future neighbors easier to deal with, and she was right. In her 40s, she picked up 2 more parcels when the county auctioned off a defunct estate, parcels that had been idle for years and wanted tending, and she tended them. By the time she was 50, she had 300 acres, most of it working. By the time she was 60, she had a reputation in the valley for 2 things, knowing land and knowing how to wait. By the time she was 73, she had been called, at various points in her life, Brilliant, ruthless, patient, calculating, impossible, intimidating, deeply fair, and occasionally by people who liked her or had worked for her long enough to understand her, just Alina. She did not particularly mind any of the names. She had been called worse at certain points and had survived those too. What she minded was losing. And even that, she had learned to be very patient about. The ash tree had been standing at the edge of that property line for longer than anyone in town could reliably verify, which in the valley meant it had been there for at least 150 years, and possibly closer to 200. There were photographs from the 1920s that showed it at what appeared to be full size, which meant it had been full grown when those photographs were taken, which meant it was already old when the valley was still being settled. It was the kind of tree that made people slow down to look at it. Old and wide and gray-barked, with roots that pushed up through the soil in long, smooth curves like the knuckles of something buried enormous and patient beneath the ground. The canopy spread in every direction with a generosity that seemed deliberate, as if the tree had made a considered decision early in its life that it was going to take all the room it was going to need, and had been doing that ever since. In summer, the leaves made a green roof so thick that the grass beneath it stayed cool and slightly damp even on the hottest afternoons. In autumn, the leaves went gold and then yellow, and then a tawny brown before they fell, and they fell in a wide circle that was larger than most people expected. In winter, the bare branches were the kind of thing that photographers came out to capture when the light was right, stark and spreading against a January sky, complicated and confident at the same time. The ash tree stood at the edge of what everyone in the valley called the Holt property, a long rolling orchard that had belonged to the Holt family for 4 generations. Apples mostly. Good apples, the kind with enough tartness to be interesting, grown in long rows that followed the gentle slope of the land down toward the creek. Margaret Holt had inherited the orchard from her mother, who had inherited it from her mother, who had received it as part of a property division when the original Holt farm was split between siblings in the 1930s. Margaret had run it for 40 years and understood every inch of it the way Alina understood her own land. Not from a map, but from having been there, from having walked it in every season and every kind of weather, until it was stored in her body the same way her own heartbeat was stored there. Thomas Holt was Margaret's grandson. He was 44 years old, a calm and careful man who had grown up in the valley and gone away to study agricultural business and come back, which was not the path everyone expected but which made sense to anyone who knew the family. He had taken over the day-to-day running of the orchard when Margaret's arthritis made the physical work difficult, about 6 years before the morning at the ash tree. He was not a dramatic person. He was the kind of man who fixed what needed fixing, said what needed saying, and did not carry grievances longer than they were useful. He had been climbing the ash tree since he was 5 years old. His daughter, Clara, named for no one in particular, just a name they had liked, was 7 years old and had been climbing it since she was 4, cautiously at first, then with increasing confidence, and on Sunday mornings, when Thomas came out to check on the orchard, he would bring his coffee in a thermos and sit on the fence and watch her climb and feel in those moments that the orchard was the right place to be and that staying had been the right decision. He never thought about who owned the tree. It was the Holt tree. It had always been the Holt tree. It was as much a part of the orchard in his mind as the apple rows or the old stone wall along the creek or the barn where his grandmother kept the equipment. Some things simply were what they were. That was the difference between Thomas Holt and Alina Duke. Alina had been thinking about the tree for 20 years. The tree sat on a thin strip of land 6 feet wide at its narrowest, perhaps 8 feet at its widest, that ran along the western edge of the Holt orchard and the eastern edge of Alina's acreage. 6 feet is not much in the ordinary sense of the phrase. 2 adults walking side by side, shoulders nearly touching. A kitchen counter from the wall to the edge. A sofa. Most people standing in it would barely notice they were in a specific place at all. Just a narrow strip of grass between 2 properties. the kind of thing that exists as a fact about the world rather than a thing you think about. But the strip held the ash tree, and the ash tree's position at the northwest corner of the contested strip, directly on the line between the two properties, made the boundary question matter in a way it would not have mattered otherwise. The tree's roots ran into both sides. Its canopy threw shade onto both properties. And more importantly, where the tree stood was directly connected to the 1887 original survey of the valley, the founding document from which all the property lines in that area were derived. The position of the strip was evidence about where the original line had been drawn. And where the original line had been drawn had implications that ran far beyond the tree itself, touching the northwest corner of Aliner's entire acreage and reshaping, in ways that were not immediately visible, what she legally owned. Aliner had understood this from the day she first looked carefully at the original deed. She had been 53 years old when she first understood it. 20 years before the morning at the tree. The first time Aliner went to court over the strip of land, she was 53 years old and had been living next to the Holt orchard for most of her adult life. She had not arrived at the decision carelessly. She had spent 2 years before the filing studying the deed records, talking to county surveyors, and understanding the history of the original 1887 survey in enough detail to be confident in what she was arguing. The original survey of the valley had established the boundary lines for all the neighboring properties in the area. The coordinates in that survey, when she had a modern surveyor apply them to current land positions, placed the 6-foot strip and the ash tree inside what was now her acreage. The Holt family had been using the strip for generations, not because it was theirs by law, but because no one had ever looked carefully enough at the original numbers to notice that it was not. She did not believe the Holts had acted in bad faith. That mattered to her. She was not accusing anyone of theft or deception. She was simply pointing out that the ground had been misread for a long time, and that the original document said something different from what everyone had assumed. Margaret Holt's attorney was a man named Howard Belcher, who had been practicing property law in the county for 35 years, and who was, by any fair assessment, very good at his work. He was not interested in Aliner's interpretation of the 1887 survey, and he said so clearly. He had his own surveyor, his own reading of the same deed, and his own argument that the historical use of the strip by the Holt family, decades of consistent, uncontested use, constituted a form of legal claim that the original survey's ambiguities could not simply override. The judge heard both sides over 2 days in a county courtroom that smelled like old carpet and photocopier toner. He ruled for Margaret on a procedural issue, but not on the substance of either argument. The procedural issue was this: the 1887 survey could not be confirmed with sufficient precision because the physical reference marker from which all the survey measurements had been made was missing. That marker was a copper disc, a medallion stamped with a date, a county seal, and a survey reference code that had been embedded in a concrete post at the original corner point of the valley survey grid in 1887. Every property line in the area had been measured from that point. It was the anchor. Every distance, every bearing, every line on every deed in that part of the county traced back to the coordinates that disc marked in the ground. Without it, Aliner's surveyor could not definitively confirm the 1887 measurements. There was simply too much room for a competing interpretation to exist. The ruling was narrow. The judge did not say Aliner was wrong. He said the evidence was insufficient to prove she was right. Aliner went home. She sat in her kitchen for a long time that evening. Not with anger, she was past the age of sustaining anger for very long, and she had never found it particularly useful. She sat with the kind of focused, deliberate quiet that people sometimes mistake for resignation, but is actually its opposite. She was not accepting defeat. She was thinking. The medallion was missing. The ruling had made that the central fact. Without it, she could not prove what she knew the original survey said. The question was whether the medallion was truly gone or whether it had simply been misplaced by time and inattention. She made herself a cup of tea. Then she started making calls. It took her 3 years to find it. The medallion had not disappeared. It had been moved, the way things in small counties get moved when roads get widened and old posts get in the way, and the road crew doing the work is not particularly concerned with what the concrete post they are pulling up might mean to someone's property line 50 years from now. In the 1940s, the county had widened the Old Valley Road. The construction crew had pulled up the concrete post, the one with the medallion embedded in it, and added it to the pile of debris from the road work. This was not recorded anywhere. There was no paperwork that said the reference post had been removed. It had simply been taken away, and the absence of any record of its removal was itself the reason it took so long to find out what had happened to it. Alina discovered this the way she discovered most things she needed to know, by talking to people, not aggressive questions, not legal questions with attorneys present and tape recorders running. Just conversations, the kind you have with older people when you visit them at home and bring something decent to eat and ask them about what they remember from when they were working, back before everything was computerized and formalized, and you had to file a request in triplicate to find out what time the sun rose. She talked to retired county workers. She wrote letters to county records offices in a careful, courteous style that made it clear she was serious, without making it clear she was building a legal case. She drove to the county seat on Tuesday mornings, when the older staff were more likely to be at their desks and more likely to remember things that had not been entered into any database because they had happened before databases existed. After a year and a half of this, she had established, with reasonable confidence, that the concrete post had been removed in 1947 during the road widening and had ended up in a construction debris pile that was later cleared and dumped on the edge of a property that had since been sold twice. After another year, she had traced the debris dump to a specific address and learned that the property had been cleaned up in 1961 by a salvage man who had taken several loads of old metal and concrete and broken equipment to his yard. The salvage man was dead. His yard had been sold to pay his debts, but his business records, receipts, inventory logs, a series of handwritten notebooks he had kept with the thoroughness of a man who understood that old metal had value and wanted to keep track of what he had gone to his son, along with a few other things that were worth keeping. The son had not known what to do with the notebooks. He had kept them in a cardboard box in a storage unit for 20 years, paying the monthly fee because the cost was low enough not to force a decision, until the storage unit's facility changed ownership, and the new owners raised the rates, and the son finally sorted through what he had and took most of it to an estate auction. The estate auction had been held 2 counties over, in a town called Benton, on a Thursday in October about 20 years before Alina first went to court. At that auction, a man named Harris Odom had bought a lot that included the salvage notebooks, a set of antique surveying tools, and a tin box of miscellaneous metal items that the auctioneer had described simply as hardware and surveying oddments. Harris Odom had died of a heart attack 8 years after the auction, leaving behind a house, a truck, and a barn full of things he had bought at various sales over the years. His son, a man named Pete who worked in insurance and had not inherited his father's fondness for old things, had kept the barn full of stuff because he didn't have time to deal with it and couldn't make himself throw any of it away without going through it first. And going through it first kept getting pushed back by everything else. Alina found all of this out through her 3 years of patient asking. She found Pete Odom's telephone number through a county directory, and she called him on a Wednesday evening in September and explained, in plain terms, that she was trying to locate a historical surveying item that might have ended up in a collection his father had purchased at auction, and would he be willing to let her come and look? He said sure, come whenever. She drove out the following Wednesday morning. Pete opened the barn and stood aside, and Alina walked in and looked around at the shelves and tables and crates of things that Harris Odom had spent a lifetime accumulating. She described the medallion, a copper disc, approximately the size of a large coat button, stamped with a 4-digit year, a county seal, and a survey reference code, likely dark with age. Pete looked at her for a moment, then walked to a shelf on the far side of the barn and came back with a tin box about the size of a shoebox. He opened it and turned it toward her. There were bolts, a few old coins, some keys to locks that no longer existed, a small brass fitting from something unknown, and at the bottom, darkened to almost black, edge green with age, was a copper disc that Alina recognized immediately even though she had never held it before, because the shape of it, the weight of it even just sitting in the tin box, matched exactly what she had spent 3 years looking for. She picked it up carefully. The markings were still clear. The year, the county seal, the survey reference code. She set it back in the tin box. She asked Pete what he wanted for the tin box and its contents. He said he had never expected it to be worth anything, but since she had come all this way, she could have the box for $100. She paid him $80, and he accepted it happily. She drove home. She stopped at a jeweler in Grover's Mill and bought a small velvet-lined case, the kind that is normally used for a ring or a small pendant, and she put the medallion inside. She drove to her house and put the case in the fireproof safe in her office, which she kept locked with a key on a chain she wore around her neck. She did not call her attorney. She did not tell her neighbors. She did not mention it at the feed store or the diner or at any of the county meetings she attended. She said nothing to Margaret Holt when she saw her, which was every few weeks, because the valley was small enough that people who lived near each other had to exist in the same spaces. She had been 56 years old on the day she found the medallion. She was 73 when she used it. 17 years. People sometimes think that keeping a secret for 17 years is an extraordinary act of will. Alina did not think of it that way. She thought of it the way she thought of tending land. You did not cut the timber until the timber was ready. You did not plant in frozen ground. You waited for the conditions to be right and then you acted, and the waiting was not a sacrifice. It was part of the work. She said good morning to Margaret Holt at the feed store for 17 years. She watched Thomas grow from a teenager who helped his grandmother with the orchard into a father who brought his daughter there on Sunday mornings. She drove past the ash tree twice a day, every day, on her way in and out of her own property, and she looked at it the way you look at something that belongs to you and that you are allowing a small misdirection to keep from you temporarily, because you know that the misdirection has a limit and you are the one who decides when it ends. Nobody in the valley understood her patience. She stopped trying to explain it. She went back to court a second time when she was 68. She still did not use the medallion. She was not ready yet, and more than that, she did not want to use it as her opening argument. The medallion was the end of the story. You do not arrive at the beginning and immediately show the audience the ending. You build toward it. You make the ending feel inevitable by showing everything that led to it, so that when it arrives it feels not like a surprise but like the only possible conclusion to everything that came before. Alina understood this intuitively in the way she understood most things, not as a formal principle, but as something she had absorbed from years of watching how things played out when you were patient, and how they fell apart when you were not. For her second case, she used a different argument. She had found, in the county records, a right-of-way document from 1921 that she believed established the 6-foot strip as a formally maintained access corridor, a path that had legal status as a defined feature of the landscape, not merely as a disputed strip between two properties. If the corridor had that status, then the question of which family maintained it, and who had the legal right to alter it or claim the improvements along it, was a different question entirely from simple boundary ownership. Howard Belcher, still representing the Holts, found the technical flaws in the 1921 document that Aliner had not fully anticipated. The right-of-way had never been renewed after its original 30-year term. It had lapsed in 1951. Whatever status it had conferred had dissolved before either family involved in the current dispute had taken ownership of their respective properties. The judge ruled for Margaret again. Aliner drove home in the November dark and made dinner and went to bed. That evening, Margaret Holt called her. Aliner was in the kitchen when the phone rang, and she picked it up and heard Margaret's voice, and stood very still for a moment because it was not what she expected. Margaret said she hoped Aliner was doing all right. She said she knew these things were difficult, and she hoped Aliner could find some peace about the matter. The words were kind. The sentiment was genuine. Aliner could hear both of those things clearly. She thanked Margaret and said good night and hung up. She sat at the kitchen table with her cold dinner in front of her and thought for a long time about what Margaret meant by peace, and whether Margaret understood the distinction between peace and surrender, and whether, from Margaret's perspective, those two things felt like the same thing. She decided they probably did, from where Margaret was standing. She decided Margaret was not wrong to see it that way, from where Margaret was standing. She also decided that she was not standing where Margaret thought she was standing. She washed her dishes and went to bed. The year Aliner turned 73, she hired a new attorney. Her previous attorney, a local man named Ray Dutton, who had represented her through both court filings, had retired the previous spring and moved to be near his grandchildren in another state. Ray had been competent and careful, and Aliner had appreciated those qualities. He had also been a valley man all his life, which meant he had his own layers of history with everyone involved, his own sense of what was realistic and what was not, his own quiet sympathies that occasionally colored his advice in ways Aliner had noticed but not always appreciated. Philip Reyes had been practicing property law for 14 years, the last 6 of which had been in the county seat, about 30 miles from the valley. He was 40 years old, methodical, and had not grown up in the area. He did not know the Holt family. He had no feelings about the ash tree. He had no sense of what the valley thought about Aliner Duke, because he had not heard the valley's various opinions accumulate over decades into a settled consensus. He came to the case clean, which was exactly what Aliner needed at this point. She met with him twice before she told him about the medallion. She wanted to understand him first. She wanted to see how he thought, how he asked questions, what he did when he did not yet know the answer to something. She had learned over decades of doing business with people that the quality of a person was most visible not in what they knew but in how they handled not knowing. Philip, it turned out, handled it the right way. He said he didn't know, he asked a specific question, and he waited for the answer. On their third meeting, she put the velvet case on his desk and opened it without preamble. He looked at the medallion without touching it. He leaned forward in his chair and read the stamped markings and sat back. He was quiet for a moment in the way that people are quiet when they are recalibrating what they thought they understood about a situation. He said this changed things. She said she knew. He asked how long she had been holding on to it. She said 17 years. He started to formulate a follow-up question and looked at her face and stopped. He had learned enough about her in 2 meetings to recognize that some questions had already been answered and did not need to be asked again. They spent the next 3 months building the case. Philip engaged a surveying firm that specialized in historical boundary work, a firm out of the city with access to modern GPS equipment, and a methodologist who had worked on historical land disputes in several counties, and who understood how to present technical evidence in a way that was legible to a court rather than only to other surveyors. The methodologist examined the 1887 map. He calibrated the survey's recorded coordinates against the medallion's physical markings. He cross-referenced the results against county boundary records that had, in the years since Aliner's first two cases, been digitized and made searchable in ways that simply had not been possible before. The records included a set of 1887 field notes from the original survey crew that had been stored in the county archive for over 100 years without ever being properly indexed. Nobody had looked at them because nobody had known they were there. Those field notes, when the methodologist found them, contained a set of direct distance measurements from the medallion post to the ash tree. The numbers were exact. The numbers were unambiguous. The numbers placed the ash tree on Aliner's side of the original survey line. The strip of land was hers. The tree was hers. It had always been hers. But Aliner did not want to file the paperwork first. She sat across from Philip in his office with all the evidence assembled in front of them. The medallion, the 1887 map, the GPS calibration, the field notes, the methodologist's report, and she told him she wanted to go to the tree before they filed anything. Philip was a patient man, patient in the professional sense, but she could see him working through the logic of this and finding it irregular. He said the filing happened at the courthouse. She said she understood that. She wanted 1 hour at the tree before the courthouse. She wanted to be there, at the ash tree, with the medallion, with witnesses, and she wanted the moment to happen in that place before it became a case number and a set of documents filed in a manila folder in a clerk's office. He asked her why. She thought about how to answer that honestly. She said that 20 years was a long time to carry something, and that she wanted to put it down in the right place. The courthouse was the right place for the legal part of it, but the tree was the right place for the part that was not legal. Philip sat with this for a moment. He said that if a licensed court officer were present at the tree to formally witness and document the evidence presentation, to create a notarized record of the artifact being identified and authenticated at its point of legal relevance, that could be structured as a legitimate legal act in its own right, not just theater. Aliner said that was exactly what she had had in mind. She had not known the specific legal terminology for it. She had known what she wanted, and she had trusted that the legal terminology would exist somewhere, because, in her experience, it usually did. People had been wanting to do things for a long time, and the law had usually gotten around to accommodating most of them. Philip arranged for a licensed process server and court officer to be present. He arranged for a notary to accompany them. He made sure the documentation would be airtight. Aliner went home and ironed her best jacket. It was a Thursday morning in early September when she drove out to the property line, and the valley was doing what it did in early September, releasing summer the way someone lets go of something they have been holding tightly, one finger at a time. The air had that particular quality of those weeks just before autumn properly arrives, when the days are still warm but the mornings are cool, and the light comes in at an angle that is not summer's angle, something more considered, something that makes the colors of everything look slightly more deliberate than they did in July. The sky was a deep, clear blue with no haze anywhere. The valley smelled of dry grass and warm earth, and faintly, from somewhere up the road, the first wood smoke of the season from someone who had started their stove a few weeks early. The ash tree stood where it always stood. On that particular morning it looked exactly the way it always looked, ancient and unhurried, the bark pale and ridged and complicated with age, the roots curving up from the soil in their familiar long sweeps, the canopy broad and settled against the sky. A few leaves at the tips of the outer branches had started to go yellow at the edges, the tree's first acknowledgement that the season was changing. Everything else was still summer green. Thomas Holt was there when Aliner arrived, which she had not arranged but which did not surprise her. He was repairing a section of fence on the Holt side of the property, about 40 feet from the ash tree, using a post hole digger, and a length of new wire he had coiled in the bed of his truck. His thermos sat on the tailgate. He had come out early, as he often did in September before the harvest work got heavy, to do the kind of maintenance that was easier with cool air and morning light. He had his back to the road when the three vehicles pulled up: Elinor's truck, Philip's car, the county vehicle carrying Clara Osei, the licensed court officer Philip had arranged. Thomas turned and looked. He recognized Elinor's truck, and then recognized Elinor getting out of it, and then registered the other vehicles and the other people, and looked from face to face with the expression of someone who is trying to understand what is happening and has not yet succeeded. He set down the post-hole digger. He said Elinor's name with a question in it. She did not answer right away. She walked toward the ash tree at the pace her knees allowed, which was measured and steady. The ground between the road and the tree was uneven. The roots of the tree had pushed up through the soil in several places over the years and made the approach irregular, and she picked her way across it carefully. She carried the small velvet case in her right hand. She did not look at Thomas as she walked. She looked at the tree. When she reached the base of the ash tree, she stopped. She stood in front of it for a moment with her hand resting on the nearest root, feeling the wood under her palm, smooth and cool and solid, the surface worn down by years of hands touching it, Thomas's daughter's hands among them, and Thomas's hands before hers, and his grandmother's before that. Then she lowered herself to one knee. It was not fast. It was not graceful. Her left knee had been replaced 3 years ago and her right was overdue, and going down to the ground and coming back up required a kind of negotiation with her own body that she had gotten used to conducting without complaint. She used the root to steady herself. She took her time. She got there. Thomas took an instinctive step forward, thinking she had lost her balance, and Philip stepped slightly in front of him, not blocking him, not aggressive, just present, and put one hand up in a calm, quiet gesture that said, "Wait." Thomas stopped. Elinor opened the velvet case. The medallion lay inside on its square of cotton batting, dark copper and green-edged, the stamped markings clearly visible in the morning light. The year 1887, the county seal, the survey reference code. Thomas stared at it. He was a man who knew land and documents and the history of boundary disputes in that valley, and he was looking at something he had never seen before, but that he recognized immediately in the way you recognize something that has been missing from a story for a long time. The piece that was always supposed to be there, and was not, the absence that had shaped everything around it. Elinor looked up at him. He was standing with the morning light behind him and his hands at his sides, and the question on his face fully formed now, fully arrived, even before she said a word. She smiled. It was not a triumphant smile. It was not the smile of someone who has beaten someone else and wants them to know it. It was something quieter and more personal than that, the expression of someone who has kept something in their chest for a very long time and has finally decided that today is the day to put it down, and is feeling in this moment the particular lightness that follows. She said, "Now it's mine." The words were quiet. The valley was quiet around them. The ash tree above them did not move because the air that morning was perfectly still. She had not said it loudly, had not announced it or performed it. She had said it the way you say something you have rehearsed so many times inside your own head that when the moment finally arrives the words come out very simply and very plainly, stripped of everything that surrounded them in all the internal rehearsals, down to just the statement itself. "Now it's mine." Clara Osei stepped forward with her folder. She announced, formally and clearly and for the record, the date, the time, the exact location by GPS coordinates, and the nature of the evidence being presented. She identified herself and her credentials. She photographed the medallion in its velvet case at the base of the ash tree, using a camera that recorded the metadata of time and location with each image. She photographed the case closed and then open. She photographed the tree itself, its base, the root system, and the surrounding land from several angles. She noted in a written statement the names of all parties present and their roles. She signed and date-stamped a notarized document that Philip handed her confirming the identity of the artifact, its provenance as described by Aliner, and the circumstances of its formal presentation. This took about 12 minutes. Thomas stood and watched the whole thing. He did not interrupt. He did not speak. He had the look of a man who is watching something he cannot stop and has decided that the dignified response is to watch it all the way through rather than to make it worse by interrupting. When Clara finished, Aliner accepted Philip's hand on her elbow and came up from the ground in the careful, negotiated way she had gone down. She straightened her jacket. She brushed the dry grass from her trouser knee. She closed the velvet case and tucked it under her arm. Thomas found his voice. He asked her how long she had had it. She said 17 years. He looked at her for a long moment, not with anger, or not only with anger, if there was anger under the surface somewhere, but with the expression of someone recalculating a long sequence of events from the beginning with new information. Every morning she had driven past this tree. Every time their paths had crossed in town. Every conversation about the orchard, about the valley, about farming and weather and the price of things, all of it had been happening while she carried this in a safe in her office. The boundary dispute he had believed was settled had never been settled. She had known that. She had been the only one who knew that, and she had waited. He asked her why she had waited so long. She thought about it. She said she had not been ready before. He looked like he wanted to pursue that answer and then decided against it. Maybe because the answer taken at face value was actually a complete one. She had not been ready before. Now she was. That was the whole explanation. Aliner nodded once to Clara, once to Philip. She walked back to her truck. At 2:15 that afternoon, Philip filed the full package of evidence at the county courthouse. The medallion, the 1887 map, the GPS calibration report, the original survey field notes, the methodologist's analysis, and the notarized documentation of the morning's presentation at the ash tree. Margaret Holt was in her kitchen when Thomas came home that evening. She was 81 years old and she moved carefully now, the arthritis in her hands making the familiar kitchen motions slower than they had once been, but she still cooked dinner most evenings because it was one of the last things she did entirely on her own terms, and she intended to keep it that way for as long as possible. She had made a pot of soup. She had cut bread from a loaf she had baked 2 days ago. She had set the table the way she had set it every evening of her adult life. Thomas sat down across from her, and she looked at his face and knew something had happened. She asked him what. He told her all of it. He told her about the 3 vehicles pulling up in the morning. He told her about Aliner walking to the ash tree with the velvet case. He told her about the kneeling and the steadying hand on the root and the court officer with her camera and her notarized forms. He told her about the copper disc with the 1887 date stamp. He told her what Aliner had said. He told her about the smile. Margaret listened without speaking. She held her bread in one hand and her soup spoon in the other, and she listened to her grandson describe the end of a 30-year argument, and she did not interrupt once, and her face did not change in any obvious way, though she was listening very carefully to every word. When Thomas finished, she was quiet. The kitchen was quiet. Outside the kitchen window the valley had gone dark, and the first stars were out, and the orchard was just a row of shapes against the darker sky. Margaret set down her spoon. She thought about Aliner at 56, finding a copper disc in a tin box in a stranger's barn, and driving home and buying a velvet case and putting it in a fireproof safe and not telling anyone. She thought about 17 years of that. 17 years of good mornings at the feed store. 17 years of watching the orchard from across the property line. 17 years of knowing something that no one else knew, and carrying it the way you carry something you are not ready to put down yet because the time is not right. She thought about what that required of a person. Then she laughed. It was a real laugh, not a polite one. It came from somewhere deep in the chest, and it was unguarded and genuine, and it surprised Thomas, who had expected anything except that. Margaret laughed until her eyes watered. She picked up her napkin and wiped them. Thomas watched her. Margaret set the napkin down and picked up her bread again. She said, "That woman prepared for this longer than I prepared for my own retirement." She shook her head once, with the specific motion of someone acknowledging that the other person won, entirely and completely, and that the winning was not the kind you can argue with. She finished her soup. She said nothing else about it that evening. Lying in bed later that night, in the dark of the farmhouse bedroom where she had slept for 40 years, Margaret thought about Eleanor Duke and the velvet case and the smile. She thought about the tree, which she would probably never climb again, which she hadn't climbed in 30 years, but which she had always assumed was hers in the way that things that have always been yours are yours. She thought about what it would be like to carry 17 years of certainty without letting it show. She decided it must have required a kind of discipline that she, Margaret, was honest enough to admit she probably did not have. She went asleep. The court ruled in Eleanor's favor 4 months later. The evidence package Philip had filed was comprehensive to the point where there was very little room for a competing argument. The medallion's provenance was thoroughly documented. The survey methodology was technically sound and had been peer-reviewed by 2 independent surveyors. The 1887 field notes, the ones that had been sitting uncatalogued in the county archive for a century, contained the direct measurements from the original survey crew that placed the ash tree's position unmistakably on Eleanor's side of the original line. Margaret's new attorney filed an objection based on a procedural argument about the timing of the evidence's introduction, and the judge reviewed it and dismissed it in a 3-paragraph ruling that was, in its way, as definitive as Eleanor's smile had been. The 6-foot strip of land and the ash tree that had stood on it for over 200 years were legally transferred into Eleanor Duke's acreage. Eleanor signed the documents in Philip's office on a Tuesday afternoon. She thanked him, she shook his hand, she drove home. She did not put up a fence. She did not post a sign or erect a marker or make any visible change to the land around the tree. She did not call the local paper. She did not send a letter to Margaret. She did not tell the people at the feed store or the diner or the county meetings she attended. She did not even tell the 2 or 3 people in the valley who had known about the dispute for years and would have been curious about the outcome. The ash tree stood where it had always stood. The roots stayed in the ground. The canopy spread the way it had always spread. When the autumn came, the leaves fell in their wide circle, and when the spring came, the leaves returned. When Thomas's daughter came on Sunday mornings to climb it, she climbed it. And Thomas drank his coffee on the fence and watched her, the same as always. Eleanor had never wanted to stop the girl from climbing the tree. That had never been the point. She had not fought for the tree because she wanted to alter what happened at it. She had fought for it because it was hers, and because the line that ran through that 6-foot strip was the line that described, with precision, where her land began and where it ended, and she had needed the world to acknowledge that with the same precision she had always seen it in herself. Sometimes, on her way into town or on her way back from the feed store or the county seat or the small errands of a working farm life, Eleanor drove past the ash tree. And sometimes, if no one was watching, she slowed down just slightly as she passed it. Not enough to stop, not enough to make it obvious, just enough to look at it for a few extra seconds from the road, the way you look at something that belongs to you and that you are glad to see still standing, unchanged, exactly where it should be. People in that valley still talk about the morning Eleanor went to the ash tree with a velvet box. The story has passed from the people who were there to the people who heard it from them, and has acquired in the passing the quality that good stories in small towns acquire. The details are more or less accurate. The sequence is right. but the meaning of it has been worked over by enough tellings that it has settled into something richer and less precise than what actually happened, which is usually the direction true stories move in when enough time goes by and enough people have their own reasons for caring about them. Most people in the valley could not explain the legal part of it. They could not tell you what a survey medallion is, or why a copper disc from 1887 would carry legal weight in a modern court, or what the difference is between GPS calibration and traditional surveying, or how field notes from an original survey crew constitute prima facie evidence of a historical boundary line. That is the kind of knowledge that lives in county offices and law schools, and most people in small valleys do not spend a lot of time in either. What they know is the image. A woman in her 70s, bad knees and all, lowering herself to one knee at the base of a 200-year-old tree on a September morning, steadying herself on the root, and opening a small velvet box in front of witnesses, as if she were proposing something, which in a way she was. Not to the man standing nearby, not to the attorney or the court officer or to anyone watching from the road, not to the law or to the county records or to any of the formal machinery that would process the evidence and produce the ruling 4 months later. To the land itself, to the tree specifically, to the roots under her hand when she knelt, to the gray bark and the spreading branches and the 200 years of standing in that exact place, growing in every direction that was available, taking all the room there was to take. To the 17 years she had carried the medallion in a safe in her office, knowing what it meant, waiting for the moment when everything else was ready. She had gone to the ash tree and she had knelt down and she had opened the thing she had been keeping and offered it back to the place where it belonged. That is what the moment was. Not a humiliation of the Holts. Margaret's laugh that evening, deep and unguarded, suggested she did not experience it that way. Not a performance of dominance. Not theater for an audience. Something simpler and older than any of those things. A woman and a piece of land, and a long time in between. The smile was the part people remember most. Not a gloating smile. Not a smile that had anything in it for Thomas Holt or for Margaret or for any of the people who had doubted Alina over the years or told her she was being unreasonable or suggested she find some peace about the matter. It was not aimed at any of them. It was the smile of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has finally set it down exactly where it was always supposed to go. She smiled and said, "Now it's mine." It was. It had always been. She had simply needed the world to catch up to what she already knew, and she had been willing to wait as long as that took, and she had waited, and now the world had caught up, and she could set the thing down and drive home and make dinner and get up the next morning and check her fences the way her father had taught her, without having to think about it, the way you do when something is exactly as it should be. Some people spend their whole lives trying to learn that kind of patience. Alina Duke had learned it watching her father walk the perimeter of 60 acres before sunrise, in a valley where the land did not care how you felt about it, only what you did. She had done plenty. And